Joseph Christian Leyendecker. You've probably never heard of them. Illustration majors, graphic design majors, um, people that really go to a lot of museums might have heard of him. But sadly, he is not as well known as he should be. He's a fantastic illustrator, and indeed he inspired Norman Rockwell. So his name actually sounds more like Leyendecker. He used to quietly correct people, but I don't know that people ever heard him, but it technically is Leyendecker. And very successful artist. He was an artist that was successful from the beginning. Not all artist biographies are tragic events. Sometimes they are simply successful, yes, and ultimately lived in a very nice home and had a nice life. So he did work for magazines, books, advertisements, plays. Um, basically, now you see him in digital media. Again, not then, but you will occasionally see his work in digital media. He was inspired also by Gibson, and he is an artist. There is a sense that if you are a successful illustrator, oh, well, that's not an artist. I've even heard my colleagues say that, and I completely disagree. It still takes an amazing amount of creativity and talent, and so J.C. Leyendecker. So here we have a portrait of him. I think fashion has been extremely influenced by him. Uh, he particularly was known for his work with arrow shirts. You're going to see a number of really incredible images. There are a lot of handsome men. I think some of the things that we consider very attractive in men are because of J.C. Leyendecker. Chiseled chin, tall, just a certain look and a certain aesthetic. It's because, in large part, because he was a trendsetter. His work was in magazines, lots of magazines. Unconsciously, people would even see his work, and that would kind of become the epic male. Indeed, one of the male models, women used to write to him. They thought they'd found their love. So go figure. So, born 1874, he's born right around the time of the beginning of the Impressionist. His work's not impressionistic. His work is more academic. His brother, also an artist. A lot of people might not know that. His name was Francis Xavier Leyendecker, and he was actually 2 years older. But the one that gets any really of the of fame is largely the younger brother, J.C. Leyendecker. Now, in their time, they were both very well known. They were actually called the illustrator twins, but they weren't twins. They did look a lot alike, as you can see. They weren't very large, and they were well educated. They were quite short and walked in step with military precision, according to Norman Rockwell. It's said that Norman Rockwell admired him so much that he would sometimes go to the train stations where when he knew that Leyendecker would be coming back from wherever he was coming back from, and he would just wait just to see him. So he was a celebrity for Norman Rockwell. So his work is very gestural, very active. I love the active brushwork, especially the background. That's one of the key ways you can see or recognize a Leyendecker is that really active white on white background. You see that a lot. It's very, very distinctive, very signature. And I'm hearing some of you go, well, that's Impressionism. No, not really, because it's very, very active. It almost predates abstract expressionism, really. But his work is very recognizable. Handsome men, mostly, occasionally handsome or attractive women as well. And this one was called Golf or Tennis. Very, very distinctive signature as well on his work. Now, he occasionally did more traditional work that you would picture in the early 1900s. This is called the Garden Walk. So Joseph Christian Leyendecker, he sometimes went by Joe or JC. And so, but this work is a little bit early in his oeuvre. Oeuvre basically means his style, his voice, the way that his style develops. Very distinctive. So this is early on. He's kind of trying to find his artistic voice here. But it's certainly it's a lovely style, but not so recognizable as Leyendecker. There's also a very, very careful attention to fashion and detail with both sexes, not just the woman, not just the men, with both. The details are really quite magnificent. J.C. and Frank Leyendecker were, again, very successful, both of them, but J.C. was, again, much more well recognized. And that becomes a problem later, as you'll see. So they trained at the Art Institute of Chicago, and they also traveled to France. They actually received training at the Académie Julienne. And so these were well-educated young men. Couple on deck chairs. This is one of my favorites. I like this. Here you see a couple on the deck of a cruise ship, and you see them reading. The detail is remarkable, especially when you consider this is tempera. This is tempera on board, and it's just almost a commercial, really. You see these gorgeous people living an elegant life. You see that they look fashionable. She has a fringed blanket over her lap. Her hands are quite large, which I think is interesting. But they almost even look larger than his. Now, mind you, his are farther away, but even so. So nobody had to tell J.C. Leyendecker that sex sells. Before the conservative backlash of the mid-20th century, the American public celebrated his images of sleek muscle men whose glistening homoeroticism adorned endless magazine covers. Yet his name is almost forgotten. And so here, look at that background again. There's that white gestural slashing background. But it kind of adds something to it. You also see the little slash marks in the work itself. On the glistening male. If you haven't guessed it already, he was homosexual. Do I think that that might be one of the reasons why he's been forgotten? Yes, I think so. Norman Rockwell has very much overshadowed his work when they're both extremely fantastic illustrators. So his first initials stand for Joseph Christian, but they might as well stand for Joe College. So this was kind of the epic college look. Now we look at this and go, college look. College students we see, wear hoodies and jeans and t-shirts, and they're not wearing this. But it is kind of a collegiate East Coast kind of a look. So his career spanned from 1900 until World War II. He painted 300 covers for the Saturday Evening Post. And then he also did Copenhagen clothes, Interwoven Socks, that was a brand, and Princeton football players, all American collegiate types. All of these figures show up in his work. Arrow Collar Man is his most lasting legacy. And here I've also included his monogram, his signature, and another type of signature that you sometimes see. He often uses a limited palette. What I mean is, do you see a lot of red? No. Do you see a lot of blue? No. Again, he's only using a limited palette. I think that's one of the clues a lot of artists instinctively know, that using a limited palette is one way to add interest. Instead of lots and lots and lots of color where the eye doesn't really know where to move, this is a limited palette. So this was 1913, so 100 years ago. So it's hard to understand exactly how important they were in the early 20th century. They were very well known. But even so, the person that ultimately gets most of the credit was C Leyendecker. Now, Frank Xavier had a very, very distinctive, different style also. Here's a picture of the two brothers, 1896. They're quite young here. They were quite close as well. He said a good cover has a distinct silhouette. And look for that in his work. There's a strong sense of line. There is a strong silhouette in his work. So it makes sense. Sometimes his works look maybe even a little simple, but they're not. They're really, really sensational. There's really nothing like his style. This is one of the more famous images. This is one that if you Google his name, it's going to come up. Here you have two men in evening dress. A lot of people find that extremely attractive. And so this is 1911, and this is for Clouet dress shirts. And I'm sure they probably sold a lot of dress shirts from this ad. He was able to command pretty good prices because his works were so successful in the marketplace. This is Arrow Shirts 1912, and here you see two men chatting. Again, look at that strong contour line, that outermost edge. It almost looks like the painting was glued onto a background. I think you can see that strong silhouette that he's talking about. But here again, it looks like you have two men simply having a great discussion. One has these gloves in his hand. It's weird that at one point in time, people always wore their gloves when they're out and about. But not so much anymore, especially not in California where it is typically pretty warm. So limited palette again. The details are remarkable. I love the striped shirt with the striped couch. And I don't know, I just think his work is sensational. Now, when I started teaching art history, which was a number of years ago, we won't go into all that, I had not heard of him. He certainly wasn't taught to me in art history. But I think he warrants some time. And a few of my students have been familiar with his work. And oftentimes when I allow my students to choose whatever topic they want to write about, they'll choose Leyendecker because his work is interesting. His story is interesting. Sometimes you have a number of men and then just one woman in the work. That's kind of a formula you occasionally see. And I love the strong demeanor of this young woman. In fact, she almost looks handsome herself in her kind of male gear that she's wearing. And so here we have 1907. And to me, this is very much a liberated woman. And in this day and time, there was a lot of discussion about the new woman. And the Gibson girl had kind of that look, and Leyendecker has kind of that look. So there was some discussion about this new woman that was coming out, that was not silly, not vapid, not sitting at home all the time sewing. She was doing other stuff. Another example of a young woman surrounded by men. Look at the really gestural background and notice that even their faces have this subtle lines across them as well. So it's interesting. And even look at some of the unfinished parts, like right behind his hand and the cane in the foreground there. Doesn't even have, it's kind of unfinished, but it has a sense of movement to it with just a few marks. You want to know what's going on here. You see obviously a attractive woman who appears to have some wealth, which would particularly make her attractive. And then you have this man uh, with this yellow chrysanthemum, which again, there's not a lot of bright yellow in this. It really makes it pop. But again, the palette is limited. And so, and it's limited, kind of has a sense of sophistication. And it's probably trying to appeal primarily to men as well. Leyendecker in the stands. Again, see one woman surrounded by men. And then, of course, they're emphasizing the fashion. And just the details are so remarkable. Even the tapestry cloth kind of hanging off of the stand right there. I love this particular quote from a person who wrote an article on it, a collector. I'm amazed that this particular artist was able to get away with so much. As the foremost male image maker of the 20s and 30s and before, the American people swore by these images, and the Arrow Color Man received fan letters by the ton from women. His muse, if you will, was a young man and a model that shows up over and over and over again in his work. And they had a long-term relationship. His name was Charles Beach, and you're going to see that he shows up in different looks. Maybe the hair is a little different, maybe it's not so blonde in one, maybe it's darker in another. But over and over and over again, you definitely see this chiseled look, very strong, jawbones and cheekbones, very distinctive look to him. And again, very handsome. And so his Arrow color looks remind me an awful lot of that kind of Great Gatsby look. When we see these great Gatsby movies, it completely fits in with C Leyendecker. So again, he did 322 Saturday Evening Post covers painted between 1899 and 1943. That's a long career. Set the style for the magazine. And again, the aesthetic for men could very much be compared to Charles Gibson and his Gibson Girl, which I've talked about in some of my classes before. But the Gibson Girl by Charles Gibb was essentially the female prototype, and here Leyendecker has the male prototype of optimal beauty. Charles Beach by, again, C Leyendecker. This particular work is also pretty famous. Again, you see him in a rather heroic sailor outfit here. Jack Hughes' illustration in the style of Leyendecker, Arrow Color Man, homage to C Leyendecker and his lover Charles Beach. This was created for a charity auction for the LGBTQ youth homelessness charity. And when I saw it, I was really struck by it because it really is very much in the style of Leyendecker. And so just remarkable. Now, of course, in the early 1900s, Leyendecker could not get away with anything near like this. But we can. So he knew he could not break barriers. He could only suggest the subject. But it is suggested when you look. He was very influential and a trendsetter, very much so. His campaigns were extremely successful. Arrow's annual sales of collars and shirts worldwide rose by 1918 to 32 million, and by the mid-1920s to 208 million, 98% of the market share. That's tremendous. And I think you could still buy an Arrow shirt. I don't think that they are have near the status that they did in this day and time. After the Great War, when detachable collars were not really popular, some of you are going, I didn't even know they had detachable collars. Yes, they did. And there's something to be said for it because that's what gets sweaty and icky, and by changing out the color, yeah, it actually makes a little bit of sense. But uh, they did become unpopular, they did pass out of style, and ultimately they increased the production of shirts with attached collars. And again, I think that's what you can buy now. Here, Charles Beach is shown looking like a real muscle man. I mean, he just looks absolutely huge. And here it's promoting a lifeguard and these young women that are in the water wanting to be saved. And what's even more funny is he doesn't look like he's noticing at all. So it's pretty cute. It's a great cover. So both of the Leyendeckers were in Paris in a very crucial moment, 1884. They were picking up some of the French academic styles of drawing, but it was also a time when Baron von Gloden's photographs were all over the place. Von Gloden was gay and also idolized the masculine body. This was contrary to the contemporary worship of the female body as a siren or even a vampire. So, an American pinup boy, Charles Allwood Beach. And again, they were together more than 50 years, so he was very important in his life. So white tie and black tie illustration. You can see how this would capture the imagination of a nation. They just loved his work. They loved the style. There's a romance to it. It looks very, very appealing. So essentially, Arrow becomes like a pinup boy, this icon of fashionable America, a wealthy America as well, and yes, primarily white male America. But by 1920, over 1,000 letters a week were coming in, mostly from women, because of this particular model. They were in love with him. It's hard to even fathom that. Even today, in 1 month in the early 1920s, he received 17,000 fan letters, gifts, and marriage proposals. A deluge of mail, actually surpassing the great actor Rudolph Valentino of the time period. So, yeah, I thought that was really interesting. This is beautiful work. This is called At Tea. This is at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And he very much does show up in museums, but just not as much as you might think, and just not promoted anywhere near the amount that Norman Rockwell is. So JC was 29, but Beach Hunk was only 17. For the first few years, the brothers kept an apartment in New York. Beach had some sort of residence nearby. When they moved to their mansion in New Rochelle in 1914, Beach moved in with them. Their sister Augusta apparently hated him. Beach not only became Leyendecker's favorite model, but also ran the household, and their relationship lasted 50 years. So you can understand the conflict. As the sister, she thinks she should be in charge of the household. They hosted these crazy 1920s Belle Epoque parties that Beach organized, and the creme de la creme of New York society went. This was our article I was reading. He said, I was totally flabbergasted when I found references in The Great Gatsby, references about J.C. Leyendecker's work. Leyendecker Mansion in New Rochelle, he was doing okay. 1925, The Great Gatsby was published. This was by F. Scott Fitzgerald. I love the book. The Arrow colorman was universally familiar, owing to a decades-long, powerful advertising career. And this basically segued nicely with The Great Gatsby. Arrow colorman's thematic importance becomes, again, part of the cultural ground or background of this actual book. Indeed, there's actually a description in The Great Gatsby that talks about this type of man. It's really interesting to me. And this work is really quite gorgeous. The dress is gorgeous. The details are remarkable. And and you see the contrast of his gloves with her delicate hands. And so it captured the imagination of a lot of people, male and female. So there's a sense of intertextuality or intervisuality that juxtaposes the lives of the smart set in New York circa 1920s with contemporary advertising. This intervisuality involves clothing as a defining personal image. It suggests social engagement. It suggests class as well, upper class. Disguise, pretense, performance, and evokes the false yet powerful cliche that clothes make the man. Your first impression is often based on your accoutrements of your clothing, the way you carry yourself, all sorts of details. And people pick it up very, very quickly and make a judgment about us. They shouldn't, but they do. So the resemblance between the Arrow Collar Man and Gatsby was strengthened by Nick Carraway's descriptions of Gatsby. Nick Carraway is the narrator in F. Scott Fitzgerald's Great Gatsby. His tan skin, he's talking about Gatsby, was drawn attractively tight on his face, and his short hair looked as though it were trimmed every day. And so he always has this fresh, clean-cut haircut. And so, but I thought this was really interesting as well. I had no idea that he was referenced as a type in the works. In love with the elusive Gatsby, Daisy says, "You always look so cool, man." She went on innocently. You know the advertisement of the man? Before she can recover from momentary aphasia, Buchanan interrupts, irritably announcing his willingness to drive into Manhattan for what becomes in the hotel suite the confrontational moment, the dramatic scene, the building climax. And Daisy repeats the expression, the advertisement of the man. And so this is what she was talking, the advertisement of the man. Advertisements that everyone saw in the 1920s. Now, some of you may remember Robert Redford in The Great Gatsby. He's the one that was in the original. And indeed, if you look at Robert Redford, he indeed is a prototype of Charles Beach. It's really, really interesting. And then later, when there was a remake of The Great Gatsby, there's another one that's essentially the same prototype, as you'll see. So Saturday Evening Post, this is 1926, and again, the Great Gatsby was also set in the same time period. And this picture of Robert Redford is actually from the movie The Great Gatsby, and it's look at the clothes even. Do you see the clothes that look very similar to what you're seeing in the advertisement? One Fitzgerald scholar has suggested a possibility. Kerncut writes that the advertising icon Daisy has in mind is likely the Arrow Collar Man. I don't even think it's a question. And so here you definitely see this type, this Robert Redford type in this particular illustration. You can kind of see the connection too, but over and over again we see that very attractive Charles Beach. Here we have the very delicate redhead. And she was a little blonde in The Great Gatsby, but even so, just this very elegant young woman, little teeny tiny waist, and doing accomplished things like playing on the piano while this good-looking young man stands right next to her. I asked about T.S. Eliot, and he replied that Eliot rarely visited Paris, adding he looked like a young man from the advertisements for a good New York haberdasher. He was a typical young man type. He wasn't quite as young as some of the others, wasn't quite as young as Scott Fitzgerald, but they both looked like Arrow collar ads. And so he went on to talk about these connections to literature. And yes, over and over and over again, you definitely see this type. And do I think that they're drawing off each other? Absolutely. So the phrase characterizing any well-heeled, well-groomed, naturally dressed, handsome young man. Here we have Dancing Couple, 1930, and Man with Seated Lady, 1929. I mean, aren't they gorgeous? I just think they're gorgeous. Okay, just absolutely, the details are remarkable. I love this time period as well, if you haven't figured that out already. So, just the colors, the style, almost always a limited palette. She implies that you, Gatsby, are familiar with this man in an ad, this arrow collar man. In her comment to Gatsby, she's trying to specify a particular man or a kind of man, and that's Leyendecker man. So the Great Gatsby movie was produced in 1974, a long time ago, and 2013, and certainly the movies give a sense of that time period. Robert Redford certainly looks a lot like Charles Beach, so I'll also include a short clip of the movie online as well. 1974, Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. Here you see a larger picture of him posing in front of his mansion. But in these pictures, they all look wealthy, very well-to-do. Here, indeed, Overland, this is another advertisement. So he was also doing work for automobile advertisement. Indeed, when you compare that to a lot of the styles that were done in that movie. I love when pop culture and art and they all cross over. Collier's, Pierce Arrow, again, more of these automobiles that he illustrated. So, and these were also very popular. These works are by the Kuppenheimer campaign, and so he did these. You also see Charles Beach. One of the figures is more casually dressed, and the other one is just a little bit more nicely dressed. But I love the Argyle socks, and again the three-piece suit is just incredible. And then the mermaid is interesting as well. And then here, of course, I compared it to Robert Redford's pink suit because it was fun. Leonardo DiCaprio in Great Gatsby had an even better suit that compares to this. It's really remarkable. So this is a 2013 suit by Brooks Brothers, and all you need to do is change his striped tie to green, and you essentially have the same exact suit. And you certainly have a very similar type of male figure as well. And so it became kind of a sense of a luxury component that he was promoting, these luxurious, elegant lifestyle. So he stands on a staircase behind his paramour, his hand hovering in the void where tuxedo blends with the room. This dark background is pretty interesting, and he repeats it several times. Any moment he might toss it like a pair of cards, his cigarette. His bow tie is exquisitely knotted, collar stiff and starched, boutonniere like a white heart newly blossomed on his chest, everything tailored to perfection. He has a strong jaw, dimpled chin. He looks off into the distance, away from you and away from his lover too, alluringly unattached. His eyes are lowered. So, just gorgeous. So this is him actually doing something for the undergarments, for male undergarments. Little Soldier, 1916. This is Norman Rockwell's work. I began working for the Saturday Evening Post in 1960, and Leyendecker was my god. So he makes it pretty clear just exactly how influential he was. So, and this is the sort of things he would have been seen that was by Leyendecker. Just absolutely gorgeous. Leyendecker kissing Cupid. So, and this is for Easter. What this has to do with Easter, I'm not entirely sure. I guess you do have the spring flower there, and you have a sense of love in the air, but interesting. Another Kuppenheimer ad. The right posture, boys' clothes. So this was a 1920 advertisement. So he really was diverse. He did a lot of different work. 1951, at 77, Leyendecker died of a heart attack at home. He asked Charles to destroy all of his correspondence. Unfortunately, he did. I mean, certainly personal correspondence is understandable, but as an art historian, we want more of, some of the stories, some of the background, and we just don't have that. Leyendecker left him $30,000. This would have been a tremendous number in 1951. Charles died in 1954 at 72 years old, so he didn't live a lot past him. And in fact, when you have people that have been married a very, very long time, statistically, they often do die within a year of each other. It's not uncommon, especially when they've been married, like not married in this situation, but together for 50 years. Essentially married to all intents and purposes. Beach was the model for the man on the right, but the darker features of the man on the left suggest that this might have been Leyendecker using himself as a model. And indeed, I think so. He resembles him quite a bit. Although Leyendecker's stature was smaller. He was a smaller man. Beach is both the lady and the Boy Scout, and considering what's going on today with the Boy Scouts, it's amazing. And so this was a collector of Leyendecker's works. And indeed, you can definitely see some connections here, just the boldness of the face. So this is 1934 cover. Art Deco illustration from 1929. Classical God, allegory for spring, possibly both. This was a U.S. Marines illustration by C Leyendecker. I don't think they would dig it today, but because I think there is a strong homoeroticism that's difficult to miss. The male figure is clearly idealized and beautiful, very stylized. The Art Deco is very, very clear, but yeah, it's interesting that this is an advertisement for the U.S. Marines. Leyendecker was engaged to illustrate ads for other makers as well, notably Kuppenheimer, Hart, Schaffner, Marx, Interwoven Socks. Again, he did diversify quite a bit. And so some of these socks ads are really quite remarkable. I love the garters for the socks. Yeah, who knew that there were garters for men's socks? So now this particular source says it's Leyendecker, but again, I think it's a little bit more academic source says Leyendecker. was what he used to kind of mumble under his breath. So, master depictor of oiled up hunks, very much so. His ads appeared all across mainstream publications right up until the Second World War. And then here across the bottom is a number of those socks. The imagery is really quite fun of the Argyle socks and the geometric patterns. Camille Clifford, model, epic Gibson girl style. So again, this was essentially Charles Dana Gibson's image of the beautiful young woman of the early 1900s in the same way as Leyendecker. And so it's interesting to kind of see the comparison of this type. And she was very, very influential as, again, the new woman of the new century. Gibson, very successful artist in his time, hugely successful. His popularity is attested by the fact that Collier's paid him $50,000, said at the time to be the largest amount paid to an illustrator. And he rendered a double-page illustration every week for a year that were often comic, sometimes sentimental, but almost always beautiful. And so this is Charles Dana Gibson. Leyendecker's 1907 Vacation. Here you see these beautiful young women that look like Gibson girls. So he is influenced by that style as well. And then you can also see the counterpart of arrow collars and shirts, and then Charles Beach, black on black with that black background. Anyway, these would definitely be the types of the early 1900s. Charles Gibson's One Difficulty of the Game, Keeping Your Eye on the Ball. And so this idea again of the new woman, this was a type, an ideal. School days or carrying a golf club. And then you have the couple that are sitting there, they have their golf clubs, and is a caddy really necessary? In other words, they're not entirely interested in sitting and playing golf. They'd rather play some other games. This is a golf sketch, and this is also by Charles Dana Gibson. So, they're playful and they're fun, and they were also extremely popular. He was a very popular illustrator. Now, this is a kind of fun fact. Florists should absolutely, positively love Leyendecker. The May 30th, 1914 Post Mother's Day cover single-handedly birthed the flower delivery industry, and it created an American tradition. This idea of giving mother flowers on Mother's Day, and lots of people do it, actually stems from C Leyendecker. Here's another illustration of Leyendecker. This one almost looks Byzantine. You have this kind of strong backgrounds, the halo effect with all the mosaic sort of looked behind them. It's very, very stylized. It's very, very Art Deco as well. Cleanliness is next to godliness. This atypical ivory soap advertisement from 1922 features a priest. I think maybe that's like he's spiritually clean as well as physically clean, perhaps. It's interesting though. Again, they're very, very stylized. These statuesque pseudo brothers or priests. This monk is holding up a bar of soap. It reads, "Ivory soap, it floats." And so, and this, according to Collectors Weekly, since when do you use a man to sell soap? Well, why not? I thought that was interesting. C Leyendecker, Cornell Penn football player. This is also one of those works that when you start researching Leyendecker, this one comes up repeatedly as well. And I think you can see why. It's football, first of all. And it has that very, very gestural background. You have just a little bit of a shadow showing on this one. And you don't get an awful lot of shadows in his work. But again, it was part of the culture. He invented Heroes. A June 1907 cover of the Saturday Evening Post features a consolidated Joe College of the period wearing a leather sweater suggesting athletic prowess and promising youth and vitality. And so he was definitely seeking a type. And of course, he ended up with the type for many, many years. He incorporated enough personality to imply a given individual or his possibility, but was clearly drawing a dreamed of best, a distillation of essential traits. This is 1908 Collier's Magazine and 1907 Harvard Crew Team. But I really love the way there's the patterned background, there's the patterned clothes, there's, again, you have the Letterman's sweater. It's got so much going on, and yet it doesn't look overdone at all. Some of his work could easily be misidentified as the work of the more well-known Norman Rockwell, but not once you know to look for that background. That is very much signature Leyendecker. This is Norman Rockwell. I think their styles are quite different, and once you've seen a number of them, you'll see the differences. And so Rockwell was basically born a generation after Leyendecker, but admired him a great deal. And so incredible illustrator as well, but his work's entirely different. It's about American nostalgia. Rockwell's Young Love. And then you, of course, see a couple. He doesn't look as interested in his lady. Raised in the golden age of illustration, he grew up admiring Pyle, Leyendecker, and Frederick Remington. He went to school at the National Academy and the Art Students League in New York, received classical training in draftsmanship, human anatomy, and technique, learned his craft through the study of great painters who'd come before him. And this is from Crystal Bridges. And this, of course, is his famous work, where you see him looking into a mirror, looking at himself, and then you see him producing himself in a self-portrait. And then you have those interesting classical details as well. You have the classical Phrygian helmet on the top of the easel. You have a portrait of Durer, a portrait of Vincent van Gogh. And it's interesting, all the little subtle details that are here. You even have a glass that looks like it's about ready to fall off that book that's kind of holding the mirror. So here you can definitely see some similarities, I think. Leyendecker's Lady with Her New Hat is, as Cohn describes, an object of beauty and allure targeting consumers. Cohn also describes these types as fetishes of consumerism. While Thoughtful Shopper may share the same theme of purchasing clothing, Rockwell's image overcomes both target audiences, making this an image for men, women, and children, and not objectifying female beauty. So, I don't know. I still think both would sell, certainly. A few sources have stated Norman Rockwell, as a little boy, again, would literally not stalk Leyendecker, but was very interested in seeing him because he was a bit of an artist celebrity. But it's interesting that Rockwell's such a important name in illustration. Some people are still dismissive of Rockwell as an artist, which again, I have a problem with that. But even so, he is the more well-known of the two. Now, this particular work is not Rockwell. It is by C Leyendecker. Both of these covers are by C Leyendecker. And I have to tell you, they look a lot like what I know as Rockwell. So Rockwell indeed did get a lot of inspiration from Leyendecker. The lady in the orange dress shows that basically a type. This was more typical of the time period, more academic, if you will. And then the Saturday Evening Post, this one is by Norman Rockwell. Now keep in mind, they also are using a limited palette on the Saturday Evening Post because the printing process did not allow for multiple colors. So they did have more limited colors that they used in this time period. Norman Rockwell, No Swimming, 1921. This was a cover for the Saturday Evening Post. 1914, Arrow shirt ad, in contrast to Robert McGillis's more slothful man. This is another illustrator that I thought was pretty fun, and a little later. So this is Robert E. McGinnis. So good-looking man, extremely messy environment. So yes. Quite a contrast between lifestyle here. McGinnis created magazines, many magazine articles, paintings for magazine articles, I should say. The Saturday Evening Post, Good Housekeeping, Guidepost, National Geographic. He also painted posters for movies, covers of paperback books, and his work covers many genres and subjects. So Leyendecker influenced a tremendous number of artists. So this is Robert E. McGinnis. Again, this is later. This is much later, really. McGinnis is a very humble, unpretentious person, and he's very grateful to be able to do what he loves. He loves and lives to paint. But you'll recognize some of his works, perhaps. This is, again, for A Man with Golden Gun. Breakfast at Tiffany's artwork by Robert McGinnis. Thunderball artwork by Robert McGinnis. I think his work's pretty playful and fun sometimes. Thunderball, certainly. Leyendecker had his influences as well. Here he's looking back to James Tissot. James Tissot painted incredibly beautiful women in incredible fashions. In fact, he was kind of dismissed because they felt like he was some sort of fashion painter. And James Tissot is also an exceptional artist. But look at the hats in both of these images. And he would have been exposed to James Tissot's work. James Tissot was extremely well known in Europe. And remember, they were at the Academy on Julian. An interesting story, 1870s. So, and remember, Leyendecker was born in the 1870s. So this is before his time, but this would have been something that he would have recognized. So Tissot created this to appeal to British taste. His works have a narrative, something that kind of draws you in, and so he was actually born in a port town on the water, and so consequently the sea does enter into many of the themes in Tissot's work. Woman reading, and then you could see an interesting story. Of course, the irony is it's not very interesting because the girl is turning away, the woman is kind of looking like she's about ready to yawn, so they're not very interested in his map or his story. Bad News. Again, you see more of this hat that keeps recurring. And certainly the interest that Tissot had in fashion would have been something that would have caught the eye of Leyendecker as well. This is an illustration he did for the Marines, 1939 to 45. So between 1896 and 1950, he painted more than 400 magazine covers. That's in total, all the different types. Of course, perhaps most Saturday Evening Post. Somewhere in France, doing his share. This is 1915 Frank Xavier Leyendecker. And then you can see the other one is C Leyendecker. So, and I will show you a few of Frank's as well, so you'll get an idea of both. 1918 Leyendecker for Collier. So this is Collier's cover, which is really quite lovely as well. This man looks a little bit more, I don't know, a little craggy, a little darker, a little different than his typical type. But you have the signature background, you have the signature that's so distinctive as a Leyendecker as well, and certainly he's handsome. Last Saturday Evening Post cover, C Leyendecker. This is 1943. He also produced a huge number of very successful images for Kellogg's. And so children did enter into his themes sometimes, but when I think of Leyendecker, I really think more of his beautiful ladies and gentlemen and living in the lap of luxury. C Leyendecker, yet another example of a female surrounded by male figures. And so this is Homecoming. So really quite beautiful. Leyendecker Butterfly Couple. This is one that's fairly well known as well. This might be something that looks familiar to you. The details are quite gorgeous. The Art Nouveau style, you can certainly see in the style of her dress. And Art Nouveau had a thing for dragonflies, butterflies, a lot of brilliant insects. Now, this is Frank Xavier Leyendecker's also did an image like this, and so this is really quite gorgeous as well. And so really striking. So he was quite the artist and should not be dismissed. Not talented as well. They were both a pretty big deal. So this is The Flapper by his older brother by 2 years. And then here you can see it juxtaposed with flapper girls and kind of this butterfly style, like if you were going to a masquerade, essentially. Franz, or Frank, as he was also called. So here you see Japonism influence. This is 1914. You see Japonism influence as well into the 1920s. So he worked in stained glass. He did have a higher profile than his younger brother in the early years. And he was well known for his Collier's Weekly magazine covers from 1902 to 1905. He also worked with Vanity Fair. Let's see, Saturday Evening Post, Palmolive Soap, Remington Guns, just incredible. His resume doesn't look bad at all. But certainly his brother's success was significantly more. And sadly, his brother had a problem with drugs and alcohol, and he ends up dying at 47 years old, sadly. So. Chevrolet Review, Strength and Service. These are allegories of strength and service. These seriously muscular men, August 1922. In 1900, the family moved to New York City, and Frank got off to a flying start. In the first 6 years, Collier's commissioned him for 26 covers, while Joe painted fewer than half that many. His illustrations were considered very important, yet he was nicknamed the Lesser Leyendecker. So, pretty sad because they were both extremely talented. Here are some examples of people at masquerade, which was, of course, a huge trend. So gray domino, domino is that mask. Domino is masquerade's kind of a style. In 1914, he moves into the private wing of his brother's newly built mansion in New Rochelle. After his partner comes in, there was friction between Frank and Beach. Remember, his sister did not like him either. Eventually, the two brothers actually fought over Beach, and Frank moved out of his brother's house in 1923, and actually into Norman Rockwell's unfinished garage apartment, which I think is interesting, a little crossing of the artist. And this is from the National Museum of American Illustration. Another example, this is again Frank X. Leyendecker. You can look for the distinctive signature, quite different than his brother's. Frank Xavier Leyendecker, 1911. Do you see his style is quite different though? So Frank was depressed and in ill health, again, from his ongoing drug addiction and a career that he felt was over. And so he passed away in 1924. Again, only 47 years old. They think it was most likely suicide by morphine overdose. Back to Leyendecker. So, not the first person to show the new year as a new baby. He certainly was the person that made the image popular and American, if you will. He popularized this idea. So here we have this baby flying in on an airplane. So, and these were just some really fun quotes I found about people's reactions to Leyendecker's work. So again, he was such an important illustrator, and it's surprising that more people do not know who he is. And this was Spice online comment. Oh my God, I feel like I call myself an artist. Excuse my ignorance, but how did I not know of this man? I'm absolutely drooling over this work. I think a lot of us feel this way. It's like, why is he not more well known? For those people recently acquainted with Leyendecker, his life story is almost as intriguing as his artwork. It reads a bit like an F. Scott Fitzgerald story. And now, of course, you know that there is even a few lines in F. Scott Fitzgerald's book that references the Leyendecker style. Rockwell even wrote of the man who was someone even the great Rockwell admired a great deal. So, 1903, the Princess Romanova, and this is, again, look for his signature style, his signature. It's distinctive from his brother, which is helpful. And then another example of Easter. And Success Magazine. These are a little bit different than his typical style. And the second image is downright Byzantine almost, with some Art Nouveau aspects as well. And so 1905, 1906. So Leyendecker produced 322 Saturday Evening Post covers compared to Rockwell's 323 Saturday Evening Night covers. Overall, Leyendecker was on more magazine covers. Do I think that Rockwell intentionally just did one more over Leyendecker? Yes. Yes, I do. But anyway, I think these are some fantastic illustrators C Leyendecker, Frank Xavier Leyendecker, Norman Rockwell, and again, I do think illustrators are artists as well.